What we're going to try and do today is bring together two of the sort of major strands that we've seen so far in this class. So in one of the earlier lectures we had a class on planning, particularly using dynamic programming methods, but we've also looked at other approaches to planning. We've also looked at model-free reinforcement learning methods based on things like Monte Carlo learning, TT learning, and so forth. And really, this lecture is all about how to bring these two things together, and we'll see that actually the same methods that we used for model-free reinforcement learning can actually be very effective as planning methods. And so there's this nice symmetry that we can really use to exploit this. There's lots of different things we can say when we start to think about the two of them together. Okay, so this is sort of the rough plan for today. So we'll start off with a brief introduction, explain how these things fit together a little bit, what the key ideas are. And then I'll talk a little bit about model-based reinforcement learning. Now this is actually a major topic in its own right, which we really haven't touched on very much at all. I'm just going to give a real outline of what's involved in model-based reinforcement learning. So these are approaches where the agent first of all learns a model of the world and then plans with that model so as to effectively solve it. And then I'm going to move on to these ideas that I just mentioned of integrated architectures. These are things where an agent both learns and plans, where it's able to use effectively methods from one side to be effective in the other, or to combine both learning and planning together in the same architecture. And then we're going to move on to methods which essentially use model-free reinforcement learning as a planning method. And in particular, we'll focus on some class of methods called simulation-based search that's been very effective recently in some large-scale problems. State-of-the-art for big planning problems. And finally, I'm just going to touch on, so I mentioned model-based reinforcement learning is a very large area, which I'm probably not going to do justice to, but time allowing, I would at least like to introduce the idea of Bayesian model-based reinforcement learning as one additional approach, which won't be mentioned up until that point. So that's sort of the plan for the day. So let's start with the introduction. Okay. So where are we up to now? Let's just do a brief recap of some of the methods we've seen so far. So in the last lecture, we saw methods for policy-based RL. So in other words, we learned the policy directly from experience. There's some agent that interacts with this world, and using those direct interactions is able to learn how to adjust its policy so as to get more reward. In the previous lecture, we also learned directly from experience, but we learned a value function. So the couple of lectures we had before then, 3 lectures before then, were how to predict using value functions, how to do control using value functions, how to do function approximation with value functions. All of this was about learning a value function directly from experience. So as an agent, it wanders around in its world, it gets a little bit of reward, and it uses that reward to update its value function. Once it has its value function, it implicitly knows how to do better in the world. It can implicitly update its policy just by acting greedily. But this lecture, we're going to take a very different approach. So we're not going to learn a value function or a policy from experience. Instead, we're going to learn a model from that experience. The agent's going to start to understand how its world works from its experience. And once it has a model of the world, it's then going to use that model to plan with respect to that model. So it's like, if you have a model of the MDP, you could do something, for example, like dynamic programming. If you have a guess of how the MDP works, well, why not just solve your guess of that MDP to construct your value function or your model? So that's the basic approach of model-based reinforcement learning. Okay. And so the idea there is we sort of integrate learning and planning together into a single architecture. So we learn a model, and then we use planning to construct that model, to construct the value function from that model. Okay, and we'll look at various ways that we can combine learning and planning. That's sort of the theme, is how these two things can be put together into a single architecture. Okay, so just to recap of what we mean by model-based and model-free RL, I think it's really important to be clear on this point. Okay, so by model-free reinforcement learning, we mean an architecture where the agent doesn't store a model of the world in its memory. And so it learns the value function and or a policy directly from experience. So if it was learning a value function, it would be value-based RL. Methods like Monte Carlo control, SASA, Q-learning, these are all examples that learn a value function directly from experience. In the last lecture, we also saw policy-based methods like reinforce, or methods that use both the policy and the value function, like the active-critic methods, to directly update a policy and or value function from experience. So again, the idea is model-free RL, the agent just interacts directly, sees some rewards, updates its value function policy from experience. In model-based RL, the agent explicitly stores this model in its memory. So it has this model, it updates the model, it's the model that gets updated from experience. And then once it has this model in memory, it uses the model to generate a value function and or a policy. So again, all of these possibilities that we looked at, value-based methods, policy-based methods, actor-critic methods, they're all possible in the context of model-based RL. The only difference is that we learn the model first, and then once we have the model, that model can be used both to construct a value function and or to construct a policy directly from that model. So the model sort of takes the place of the real world. So instead of thinking about what happens in the real world, the agent now thinks about what happens in its model, and it uses the model to construct a value function and or a policy. So how does that really look like then? So do you remember from the introductory lecture we had a slide that looks something like this, where we've got our big agent brain. This is the thing which we're trying to construct. And this agent is sort of interacting with the world, whatever that world is. You know, it might be a robot that's actually running around in some real world that it's trying to understand, or it might be, you know, your financial agent to whom the world is just a series of trading data or whatever it is. And now this agent is taking actions. The world is coming back and saying, well, you took this action, this is the reward you'll get, this is the next state that you'll see, and it goes round and round and round. And so really the way to think about what we're doing in this lecture is we're taking one step in addition to this, which looks something like this, where the agent simply replaces the real world with some model of the world. It's got like this map of what the world looks like in its head. And it constructs the map of the world from its real experience. And once it has the map of this world in its head, it can interact with that world, with that model of the world, in just the same way that it can interact with the real world. So the model takes the place of the real world. The agent can then, just by thinking, just by computation, without having to do any more real interactions with the world, just by thinking it can start to do better. So it can consider what would happen if I was in this model of the world and I took this action. Well, my model tells me that I would end up in this state and I'll get this reward. And it can go round and round and round. Or we can use the same methods that we use in the model-free case, simply by applying them to this model. That's sort of the main idea for today. Okay, so we're going to take some steps towards this goal. We're going to look at a variety of different ideas along the way. So we're going to start with sort of classic model-based reinforcement learning. So the cycle we could think of is something like this, where we have some agent sort of going round and round this circle now. So I guess we could start perhaps, you know, somewhere over here. The agent acts in the world, it takes some actions. This is its experience. It generates experience by acting in the real world. It uses its experience just to generate a model. So the whole purpose of its real experience is to generate a model. So it takes some steps and says, aha, the world is really somewhere where if I take this action, I end up in this place. Or if I take this action, I end up getting this reward. So it uses that experience to generate its model. Once it's got that model, it can start to do planning in that model. So now it can start to interact with the model and start saying, well, in my model, if I play it out in this model, if I take particular steps in the model, I'll end up getting a certain amount of reward. It can start to adjust its value function or its policy. Once it has a policy, it can actually act in the real world. So you can think of this as model learning, and this part is like planning, it's thinking. It's generated its model of how the world works. It starts to think about what to do next. By thinking, it updates its own policy, how to behave in the world. And once it's got a policy, it can use that policy to behave in the real world. So generate more experience, update its model, use the model to think about what's next, and so forth. So that's sort of the cycle of model-based reinforcement there. Okay, so there's some advantages and disadvantages of this approach. Probably list more than these. I think I'm just picking out a few really. So one of the main advantages why people like model-based reinforcement learning, people do it, is because you can think of the model learning part of this loop. This model learning part is simply supervised learning. So we have a large library of supervised learning approaches, and the idea is we just want to learn this model by supervised learning. You take a step, you see what happens in the world, you update your model, which tells you, if I take this step, this is what happens. Kind of like a regression problem. I took this step, I got this amount of reward immediately just in that one step. So we can efficiently learn that model. And then one potential additional benefit, which we'll see towards the end of this class, is you can also reason about model uncertainty. So what if your model's wrong? What if you've got some model where you think you're 70% confident that it's going to behave in a particular way? And model-based RL lets you reason about model uncertainty. So perhaps the major disadvantage of model-based reinforcement learning is that it sort of it has two steps to it. So you first of all have to learn a model, and then from that model you construct a value function. So you end up with sort of two sources of approximation error. You first learn a model from experience, and now if your model's wrong, whatever inaccuracies you have in your model then get used to construct your value function, which might have some additional inaccuracies in it, because it's a big interesting problem we're trying to solve. We don't get the exact value function even with respect to your model. So now we've got error creeping into the model and also into the value function. Whereas if we do things model-free, we directly construct a value function from the data. So if you see enough data, you'll typically end up with a better value function eventually, because you haven't had to go through this bottleneck of constructing a model. So often if you have enough experience, enough time for your robot to run around in the world, you can end up with a better representation just by directly doing model-free reinforcement learning. But it can be more efficient to learn about the model first and use that model to reason about what to do next when there's a small amount of data. Okay, so what do we mean by a model? Let's try and make this a bit more concrete. So I'm going to define a model to basically be a representation of an MDP. So we have an MDP with a state space S, an action space A, some transition dynamics P, and a reward function R. And now we're basically going to say, well, a model is some representation of our MDP. So we're basically going to assume that our state space and our action space are known, so let's not worry about those. And so we're talking about representing the transition dynamics and the reward function. We're going to have some parameters eta here, and we just want to make the best MDP we can out of our parameters eta. So what we end up with is some kind of model. So our model would be something like this: estimated transition probabilities and our estimated reward function. So we're just going to try and make these things as accurate as we can. We're going to try and make our transition dynamics look like the real transition dynamics of the world. We're going to try and make our reward function look like the real reward function of the world. Note at this stage, we're only trying to learn, we're only saying something about the one step, the immediate reward function. We're not saying anything about the long-term reward function, about the value function. We're just saying, in one step, this is how much reward you would get if you took a particular action. So the other thing, how much reward can I get if I follow a particular policy over 100 steps, that's the planning part. That's what planning will do, we'll figure out the value function. Here, we're just trying to model the world. We're trying to say, if I take one little step in the world, I'll end up here. And if I take one little step in the world, so if I'm in state ST, I take action AT, then I can use my dynamics to sample the next state, ST plus 1, and I can use my reward function to sample the next reward of the next step. So this is just immediately what happens to the agent if it takes one step. And that's enough to characterize the entire MDP. This is, after all, the definition of an MDP. So this is just a technicality, but essentially what we're doing is we're making an independent statement that these two things are independent. You don't actually have to do that through the successor state and the reward function, but this is just a detail. Okay. So the goal here is to try and estimate the model from experience then. So the agent's going to see a set of episodes like this: state, action, reward, state, action, reward, state, action, reward, all the way up to some terminal state. And the goal is to estimate what the MDP looks like. So it sees this experience, well, it has to figure out what's the MDP that it's in. And once it has an idea of that MDP, then we'll talk about planning, which is solving that MDP. So, as I mentioned before, this is a supervised learning problem, so let's make that concrete. So what we're seeing is basically the agent was in state S1, it took action A1, and it ended up getting a reward, R2, and ending up in state S2 as a result of being in this state and taking this action. So that's one training example. The next training example was at time step 2, where the agent was in state S2, it took action A2, and it ended up getting a reward R3, and it ended up in state S3 for the next time step. So we get this whole set of training data all the way up to the end of the episode, examples of being in one state and what state you ended up in after taking action. Being in a state and what reward you ended up with at the end of that, taking that action. So this is a supervised learning problem, and it's got two parts to it. So there's a regression problem. The regression problem is learning, if I'm in a particular state S, if I take a particular action A, what will the reward be to take out? That's learning a reward function. The reward function is just a straight regression problem, regressing from state and action to reward. Classic regression. Okay. We've also got a density estimation problem. In general, our transition dynamics are going to be stochastic. If they're deterministic, it's also a regression problem. But in general, they'll be stochastic, and so we've got a density estimation problem. I want to know if I start in state S and I take action A, which states will I end up in? What's the probability distribution over next states, given I started in state S and took action A? So it's a supervised learning problem. We're trying to figure out the next reward and the next state. Okay. Now to do these, I'm not going to teach you supervised learning. There's another course on that which I hope you went to. But here, essentially, you could pick your loss function. So if you want to do regression, well, maybe you choose mean squared error and optimize that. If you want to do density estimation, perhaps you pick KL divergence and optimize that, or some kind of other appropriate loss function. And so the goal is basically you're trying to match your NDP dynamics to, essentially you're trying to make your model look as close to the real NDP dynamics as you can, given data, given experience of that NDP. Okay, so let's consider some examples to make this concrete. So what's the representation? So we have this model, which is our P eta and our R eta. So the simplest example would be a table lookup model, where for every single state and action, we separately represent what will the reward be. If I start in state S and I take action A, for all states S and for all actions A, how much reward will I get, and which next state will I end up in? That's a table lookup model. We separately represent, have a big table for all state action pairs. But you could try and be cleverer. You could use function approximation to represent the model, or parametric density estimation methods, or non-parametric, or the whole toolkit of possibilities is open to you. And I'm not going to tell you about these. I just kind of want to say, well, you could have a linear model, where you basically say the expected next state is some linear combination of the state you were in before, features of the state you started in. You could have a linear Gaussian model, where you have like a Gaussian distribution over the next state you're in. This would be suitable for continuous state spaces. You want to kind of have some idea of the state you end up with. You end up in, you could model this as a Gaussian model with linear dynamics. You can have a Gaussian process model. If we get time, we'll see an example of this at the end of the lecture, where your reward function could be a Gaussian process. The transition dynamics could also be a Gaussian process, some smooth function of taking you from your state in action to the next state, the reward. You can plug in a neural network model, a deep belief network, take your pick. These are just illustrations to get you thinking that learning a model, in a sense, is nothing more or less than supervised learning, and trying to learn this MDP from experience. And I'm not claiming that's an easy problem, just that it's a known problem. It's a well understood problem in some sense. Okay, so let's take the simplest example and just get sort of some intuition for that. So we'll start with the table lookup model and see what that looks like. So the table lookup now, we're going to call this P hat and R hat. This is going to be our representation of the MDP. And what we're going to do is simply count. The way we come up with the table lookup model to learn one is just to count. This is how you get the maximum likelihood estimate of these dynamics. And so what we're going to do is basically, so let's look at the reward function first, that's perhaps easier. What we're going to say is, well, we want to know how much reward we get from state S taking action A. That's what this reward function tells us. Well, what's a simple way to estimate that? Well, just look at the mean. So every time I was in state S and took action A, that's what this indicator says. The indicator saying, was I in state S and did I take action A, this time step? Then we're going to take the mean of all the rewards at all those time steps where we really were in this particular state to this particular action. So just take the mean reward of all examples where we started in that state and took this particular action. and that's going to be our reward function. Similarly for transition dynamics, all we're going to do is we're going to count up the number of times that we actually were in state S, took action A, and then transitioned to S prime. And we're just going to normalize that by the total number of times that we were in state S and took action A. So it's a very simple way to estimate the transition dynamics just by counting how many times we went to a particular state S prime compared to all other states we could have gone to. There's an alternative way to think of this, by the way, which is sometimes useful, which is you just store your experience in memory, and then at any step, your model is just to randomly pick something which matches. So out of your experience, you search through your experience until you find something that matches a particular state and action that you're now querying it about. So you search through your experience until you find something in your experience where you really were in that state and took that action, and you randomly sample amongst the set of such experiences. And that exactly gives you the same solution, but in a sample-based way. So trading sort of memory for computation, if you like. Okay, so you might recall this example from an earlier lecture. I'm going to use it for a different purpose, so to empty your mind of how we were using this before, and let's come back to this example again. So it's a very, very simple example. There are two states, A and B, there's no discounting, and you see these 8 episodes of experience. So just as a reminder, one episode you start off in state A, you see a reward of 0, you then see state B, you get a reward of 0. The next episode you just happen to start in B and you see a reward of 1, etc. That happens several times, and then you start in B and you see a reward of 0. So naturally, we could estimate, using exactly this procedure here, we would estimate just by counting, we would count and say, okay, well, every time we were in state A, we transitioned to state B with a reward of 0, 100% of the time. So that's our estimate of what happens from A. And then from B, we would say, well, in 75% of the time, 6 out of 8 of the times we were in B, we saw a reward of 1, and we ended the episode, and 2 out of 8 times we saw a reward of 0 and ended the episode. So we've constructed a table lookup model just by counting, and now we can use this model to solve this model, for example, by dynamic programming or any planning method we want. We could just solve this model and out would pop our estimate of the value function and the policy for how to behave in this particular example. Okay, so now let's talk about planning. So far we've just talked about the model learning part, how to construct something like this, how to estimate the MDP. What do we do once we've got it? So given the model, so now we have our approximate MDP dynamics. So we basically just want to solve this MDP, our original state space and action space, and our approximate dynamics and reward function. And again, we've had lectures on this. We had a lecture on dynamic programming planning, which would be one approach. So we could plug in value iteration to this MDP. We could plug in policy iteration to this MDP. We could do some kind of tree search on this MDP, or ... Plug in your favorite planning algorithm. Okay. But what I'm really going to focus on is a particular approach that will lead us into this idea of integrating learning with planning. But it's also a very powerful approach, very simple. In some senses, it's the simplest way you might think of to do planning. It's called sample-based planning. So the goal is the same, which we're still just trying to solve this MDP, but we're going to do it in a particular way. And the idea is that we're only going to use our model to generate samples. That's the only way we're going to use our model. We're not going to do something like in dynamic programming where we sort of integrate over the model and use the actual probabilities to do a Bellman backup. So we're just going to use the model to generate samples. And the way we're going to do that is just to sample experience from the model. So if we were in some state ST and we take action 80, we're just going to generate a sample by sampling from this density estimate to get our next state. And we're going to generate a reward by looking at our reward function starting from ST and taking action 80. And so we're going to get these experience tuples from a model, and then we're going to apply model-free reinforcement learning to the samples. So we've got sampled experience. It's just like an agent walking through the world and seeing these samples. But the samples happen to come from the model. It's just basically... So we're doing this now. We're basically we're plugging in place of the real world, we're plugging in our model of the world, and we're using that to interact with our model. We're generating samples from this model by interacting with it, and that's going to be the process of thought by which the agent is solving the MDP. So we're going to apply model-free reinforcement learning to these samples. So again, we've seen examples of this in previous lectures. This might be Monte Carlo control, this might be SASA, it might be Q-learning. So model-free reinforcement learning applied to samples that we generated from our model. So what do we get out of this? Well, we get a solution that's as good as our model eventually. So if our model is wrong, we won't find an optimal solution. But if our model is good, then by going round and round and sampling more and more data from our model, if we do enough computation, then we'll find the optimal solution to our particular model, to the MDP represented by a model, just by doing more and more computation, no more interaction required. Okay. Now, here's a challenging statement. So sample-based planning methods are often more efficient than sort of full planning methods like dynamic programming. So this might seem surprising. So we've made a choice, a restriction. We've restricted ourselves to use the model only to generate samples. So we're not doing something like dynamic programming where we're actually using the probabilities of that model to do the Bellman equation and to do Bellman backups. So how can this be better? Can anyone think why sample-based planning methods might be more efficient than? So by efficient here, we're talking about computation. So when we talk about planning, it's not really about data efficiency anymore, because it's cheap to generate more samples from our model. We're talking about computation efficiency. So how we need to get more from less, basically. So we just want to be able to find the planning methods that get to the right answer as little computation as possible. So can anyone think why sample-based planning methods might be more efficient than full-width methods based on dynamic programming? So let me try and give some intuition to this. So imagine that imagine that the world has there's all kinds of things that might happen to the agent. There's all kinds of very unusual contingencies that might just happen to the agent. So there might be a million states that it could transition to next, but there's only one or two of those that are very likely. Okay? All the rest of them are just going to happen very, very rarely. And so they're not going to have very much bearing on the value function of the agent or on its policy. They're just sort of these weird contingencies that might just happen. So with probability 1 in a million, the agent might teleport to any of a trillion different states. Okay? Now in that kind of setting, dynamic programming becomes very inefficient because it has to do a full width backup. It considers that it adds up the exact probability for each of those events that might take it to each of those different states. So it does a full width backup. It's very inefficient. It suffers from the curse of dimensionality because it literally looks at every single state in its database in its backup. Whereas sample-based methods, they just take one sample, and that sample with high probability will be something relevant to the agent because it's sampled from the true dynamics of the world. And so rather than spending a million kind of computational operations doing this one full-width backup, we could just go generate a million samples from the probability distribution. Those million samples would be much more representative of where the probability mass is actually sitting in this particular problem. That's sort of some intuition as to why it's often much more efficient. So sampling can often break the curse of dimensionality in this setting. It's not necessary to do a full-width backup. Sample-based methods can actually be better for that reason. So it's not just a choice to do this because it's simple. It's often preferable to do this because it simply works better for the same amount of computation in large problems. Okay, back to this AB example. So now let's try and just develop our intuitions a bit further. So we're back to this table lookup model. So we started off with this experience here, okay? And now we're going to talk about this sample-based planning approach. So we started off with this experience. We used that experience to generate this model. This was our table lookup model. But now we've got this table lookup model, we can use this table lookup model to sample episodes of experience. So if we just sort of, I guess what I haven't shown here is we've also assumed that there's some kind of initial state probability for the MDP. because it's episodic. There's some chance you'll start in A, some chance you'll start in B. You look at this, most of the time you start in B. Okay, so our samples might have one episode here. Okay, we're going to imagine we start in B. We're going to roll some dice to see whether 75% of the time we'll go this way, 25% of the time we'll go this way. We roll our dice, we happen to go this way. Okay, so we get one episode B1. We run it again, start in B, happen to go this way, B0. So forth, we run it again, we get B1. Now we run another episode, we happen to start in A, we end up in transitioning to B, then we roll the dice and it says 75% of the time we go here. So we end up with this A0, B1 episode, which wasn't in our original experience. This is a new, we've simulated experience. We're sort of fictionalizing things that might happen to the agent in the world that are different to what actually happened to it. So we've invented some episodes based on our model, sort of hypothesizing what might happen to the agent. We're imagining things, we're imagining what might happen to the agent, and then we're solving that imagined experience. That's the idea of sample-based planning. So we run some more episodes, we get this set of sampled experience, and now the idea is instead of applying Monte Carlo learning to this, like we did in a previous lecture, what we're actually going to do is apply Monte Carlo learning to the sampled experience. That's what we mean by sample-based planning. We generate as many samples as we want, as many samples as we've got time to do, and then we apply, for example, Monte Carlo learning to this, and that would tell us that the value of A in this case is 1. We have 2 episodes, they both end up with 1. The value of B is 0.75. If you ran this for long enough, it would converge on the solution to this MDP. Whereas if you just ran Monte Carlo learning on this, it would always believe that the value of A is 0. Because it's just got this one episode of experience, which ended up getting 0 reward. So we've constructed a model from the data, and then we solve the model, and we can get better solutions by that approach. Okay, is that clear? Right. So I've briefly touched on this. So often our model is not perfect. So it's a hard problem to learn how the world works. The world can be a complicated place. So normally we end up in a situation where we have an imperfect model. We have some model where we haven't quite either learned the parameters that would match our model exactly, or the true model doesn't even sit in the space of representable models in our class of hypothesis class. So our supervised learning process is imperfect. We end up with an imperfect model. So what do? Well, in this case, how well can we do? So even if we had the perfect planning problem, the perfect planning method, our perfect planning method could only ever find the optimal policy with respect to our approximate MDP. It's not going to find the true solution to the MDP. In other words, model-based RL is only as good as the model, as you might expect. So if the model's not very good, if the model's inaccurate, and we do planning with that inaccurate model, then we'll find some suboptimal policy. And this is a very common case where the model just isn't that good because it's a hard problem, we haven't seen that much experience. So what do? Any thoughts on what you would do if you have an inaccurate model? It's early, I know. All right, so here's one idea. Well, if the model's wrong, then use model-free reinforcement learning. So if the model's wrong, don't trust it. So eventually, if you see enough experience, then even if your model is wrong, if you're using model-free reinforcement learning, you'll find the right answer given enough experience. You'll solve the true MDP. And what we'll look at shortly is ways to combine model-free reinforcement learning with model-based reinforcement learning. And so it's natural to think that you might control the trade-off between those things. So depending on how right your model is, you use more and more model-based RL. And if your model is very, very bad, then you do more model-free reinforcement learning. There's a lot of evidence, by the way, that the human brain has two sort of different circuits in it, one of which does model-based reinforcement learning, one of which does model-free reinforcement learning. It's a very hot research topic. The second approach, which is we'll come to at the end, is reasoning explicitly about model uncertainty. So here we've got, this is sort of the Bayesian viewpoint. Well, or at least that's one approach. So for example, you might say, well, the model's inaccurate, but we might keep some distribution over what the world looks like. So we don't commit entirely to one particular hypothesis about the world. We maintain a distribution over all the different ways the world might be, and then reason explicitly about that whole distribution, so we're much more robust to our possibility that the world might look like any one of these different things. Okay, so those are some possibilities for inaccurate models. Okay, so integrated architecture. So this is where we start pulling things together and start playing with, start sort of blurring the boundary between model-based and model-free reinforcement learning, between learning and planning, and we'll start blurring the boundaries a little bit. Okay, so we've already seen that there are sort of two possible sources of experience. So real experience, what do we mean by that? Well, we mean that the actual agent, this actual agent is wandering around in the environment in this true MDP, and as it wanders around, it gets samples of next state by interacting with its dynamics, it gets samples of the reward. This is it all interacting with the real MDP here, so seeing real states, real rewards, taking real actions. But we also have this idea of simulated experience. So by simulated experience, we mean that we use the model. This is now where we're substituting the model for the real world. And the agent is simulating experience and sampling from the model. Okay? So where before it was interacting with the real world, here, through a process of thought, the agent is interacting with the model, and it's using that model to to sample the experience. So it's just like this example here. So we have the real experience, we have the simulated experience here. Okay, so the idea is we're now going to sort of combine these two sources of experience and do better than if we just learn from either one source alone. So what we've seen so far then, we had our model-free reinforcement learning where there was no model. We're learning the value function directly from real experience. That was model-free. We've just been looking at model-based RL, using sample-based planning, where the model was learned from real experience. And then, so the only thing that the real experience was used for was to generate the model, and then essentially the real experience is kind of thrown away after that. And then the model is used to plan a value function. So there's some planning method that uses the model to generate a value function, possibly a policy if it's connect-critic or policy-based, by sampling from the model. Okay. Now the natural idea is to combine these two ideas together, and this is called the Diner architecture. It's an old idea by Rich Sutton, dating back to 1992. And the idea is to, again, learn a model from real experience. But now, both the real experience and the simulated experience are combined together to learn the value function. So rather than sort of throwing away the real experience at this point, the real experience is used to update the value function, and also the imaginary experience, the simulated experience, is used to update the value function. That's the Diner idea. So it looks a bit like this, where we have now the same circle we had before for model-based reinforcement learning. We've got this additional arc that's been added in here. So now we have an architecture where the agent, it takes its actions in the world. As a result of that experience, it learns a model. As a result of that model, it's able to plan an updated value function and or policy. But it's also updating its value function and or policy directly from experience. So this is basically what was model-free RL, sometimes called direct RL. And this way around here is model-based RL. So this part model-based, this part model-free. Now we're combining them together to get the value function for both of those. Okay, so here's an algorithm. This is perhaps the simplest example of the Diner architecture. There's all kinds of versions of this, but this is called the Diner Q algorithm. It basically uses Q-learning updates for both real and simulated experience. So the idea is basically that you start off with some action value function Q, you start off with some model, and basically at each step you take some action A, you observe the state that you end up in and the reward that you get. So this is a real action here. Okay, so you take a real action, the agent, your robot's actually interacting with this environment. And now, as a result of that real action, it updates its action value function using a Q-learning update, or a Salsa update, or this could be Monte Carlo, whatever you want to have. So it does a Q-learning update here based on this real experience. It also updates its model. So it updates its model to take account of this particular transition that's just seen. So it was in state S, it took action A, ended up in S prime, and got reward R. So it's going to update its model. This is the supervised learning part. And the simplest instance of this would just be to remember the transitions you've seen before and pull them out of your memory, as we talked about before. And now, here's the sort of thinking part. This is sort of the cognitive loop where the agent is now stopping to think before it takes its next action. So it thinks for a little bit, n times, and so the atom of thought is one of these steps. But at each step, it's going to pick some random S, which might be something it's previously observed. It could be something different if the model has generalization in it. It's going to take an action, imagine an action that it might take. It's going to basically use the model to imagine what would happen as a result of that particular state, taking that action in that particular state, and then apply a Q-learning update from this hypothetical experience. So it's sampling experience from the model here and applying Q-learning as a result of that sampled experience. A more modern version of this would actually do something on policy here, so pick the action according to some policy. So basically we're doing SASA, n steps of SASA. The crucial point here is that every step of this cognitive loop, it's sampling, it's taking an action and sampling what would happen from the model. And then going round and round saying, what if I did this, what would happen? What if I did that, what would happen? What if I did this? Going round and round n times, do as much computation as it wants. And then only once it's finished this computation does it go back and take the next action in the real world. So let's go back to our favourite grid world examples. So here's a grid world, trying to get from here to here, simply moving around here. And this basically plot is just going to show us the number of episodes and the number of steps per episode it's taking to complete this thing. So to begin with no experience at all, the agent's just moving around randomly, so it takes 800 odd steps to reach the goal just by doing a random walk around here. This line here is what happens if you were to just run standard model-free reinforcement learning algorithm with table lookup. So this is basically Q-learning in this case. And it's very slow to figure out what's going on. It takes a lot of real experience before it actually gets to the point where it's figured out how to solve this particular maze. So that's just using direct reinforcement learning, this model-free Q-learning. But we can ask the question, what happens if we now do n steps of thinking before taking the next action? So every step, the agent is building up a model based on what it's seen, it's running down a queue, and every step, every real step here, it's doing 5 units of computation to imagine 5 additional steps. And you can see it very, very quickly figures out how to solve the maze. This is with 50 tiny steps, even faster, figures out how to solve this maze almost straight away. Yeah?
In effect, it will do the same amount of steps, it will just do like virtual steps instead of actual. Is that correct? So in terms of the number of times you have to loop to get it to converge?
Yeah, but the key fact is that this might be some physical system where it's very expensive to interact with the real world. So it can both take a lot of time to interact with the real world, like if you're trying to run an experiment with a robot, and also there can be really bad negative rewards by learning from the real world. Whereas if you're doing just things in your head, imagining what might happen, it's okay to imagine what might happen if you fall off a cliff. Right? You imagine what would happen if I fall off this cliff, I'm going to really just be splattered into a million pieces. Whereas if you really explore that for real, then that's the end, right? So the idea is to use thought as a process to become data efficient by just going over the data, getting as much as you can from the data by generating a model and extracting as much as you can from that model just by process of sample-based interaction. Okay. So this is just a couple of slides to illustrate what happens if you use an inaccurate model. So you can start with a simple maze like this, going from here to here, and then you can say, well, what happens if we make it harder, like this? And this is just an illustration to show that basically you need to force, so this is basically the point at which the problem changes. Okay? So this is using a variety of different diner algorithms. This is the cumulative reward here. So actually now the slope wants to be as steep as possible. So the steeper it's getting, the more reward it's getting per time step. So down here it starts off not getting very much reward per time step, but soon it's getting the maximum amount per time step that it can from this maze. So very quickly, just like we saw in the last episode. So here we're getting the most out of the maze that we can. And then what happens is at a certain point, we're going to switch, we're going to change the world to something harder. What's going to happen is things are going to flatten out now. And the reason they flatten out is that the agent's got a model of the world that's now wrong. So it's got this inaccurate model of the world. It thinks the world looks like this. It's going to carry on interacting with the world as if it looks like this. And so the only way it can correct that model is if it's encouraged to explore the real world every now and then until it figures out that there's some problem with its model. And that's what this DynaQ Plus does. It's an instance of something which does an exploration bonus. We'll talk next lecture more about exploration and how to do it efficiently. And this is an instance where there's a bonus for exploring less visited states. And that just ensures that the agent continues to update its model. Its model never stagnates. It's able to just make sure that it does better and better. Okay. This is an example of what happens if the environment gets easier. So it's like we flipped it. So we started off with this one where I had to figure out the whole dynamics, and then the problem gets easier where this route is still available, but this better route becomes available. Again, after the point of changing the dynamics, again, you need to encourage some amount of exploration. Otherwise, the agent continues to believe that there's no way through here, and it has to continue to explore to ensure that it finds this additional, better route here. Okay, so that's the diner architecture. Is that clear? Okay. So now let's talk about simulation-based search. So this is a really, again, a sort of hot topic now. It's been very led to a lot of exciting results recently. So let me begin by talking about forward search. So the idea we're going to think about now is planning algorithms which select the best action by look ahead. So forward search is a type of planning that just focuses on what's going to happen next to the agent. So in particular, they build a search tree, and they build a search tree that's rooted at the current state. So the agent's at this state and wants to know, well, what's going to happen to it as it sort of starts to, what's going to happen over the next step, over the next 2 steps. And it's going to use a model of the MDP to look ahead. So you need some model to be able to look ahead. You need to be able to say, well, if I took this step, this is what's going to happen to me. And then if I took that step, this is what might happen to me. So if you have a model, you can start to build a search tree like this. And you can start to say, well, you're in this state, ST, build a search tree, start to imagine what's going to happen to you step after step, and now basically solve this search tree. You know how much reward you're going to get from all of these particular choices you could take. Now you can solve for the search tree and pick the actions that lead to the best expected return. Okay, so that's the idea of forward search. The obvious problem with forward search is that this search tree is big. So it blows up exponentially with the depth of the search tree. If you need to look ahead some large number of steps, this thing quickly becomes intractable. Okay. But what's nice about forward search is that instead of trying to solve the entire MDP, which in general might be enormous, it's just focusing on the MDP that sort of starts from now. So there might be a whole other part to this MDP. Maybe the MDP started in some state here, and there was some way eventually to reach this current state. But there's all kinds of other parts of the world that aren't even reachable from the current time step anymore, or just irrelevant, or won't be reached for a million time steps again. It's like you're at the top of the mountain, you're at the bottom of Everest, and you're trying to climb up a mountain, and you need to know, well, what's the best way to get up Everest. So at that point, you don't worry about how to sail a ship. You just worry about how to find the best path up the mountain. And then the next week, when you're on the ship, you really don't care how to climb Everest anymore. You just want to figure out, well, what's the best way to get back to shore safely. So that's the idea of forward search. Just focus on the sub-MDP, the MDP that starts from this state, which we can call now. Okay, so simulation-based search is a forward search paradigm that uses sample-based planning. So it's combining two ideas which is doing this forward search by sample-based planning. And the idea is very straightforward. The idea is to start from now, so you start from the current state, and then simulate episodes of experience that start from now. So you simulate complete episodes. And so you might start here, and in one episode you might simulate and say, well, I might take this action, the environment might put me in this state according to my model. I might take this action, the environment might put me in this state. I might take this action, the environment might terminate. And that would be one simulation. And then the next simulation we do something completely different. And the next simulation we do something completely different. And then the idea is that we simply apply model-free reinforcement learning to the simulated episodes. So we're generating complete episodes starting from now. And by doing that, we're creating a reinforcement learning problem, a model-free reinforcement learning problem, where we're just going to solve for the sort of sub-MDP starting from now. We're generating experience, we're generating episodes of experience. It's just as if we were running the problem starting from now, again and again and again, and interacting with just that sub-problem again and again and again, seeing more experience, and we're going to just try and solve that experience by applying model-free reinforcement learning to that experience. Okay, so just to make that concrete, we're going to simulate episodes of experience from now. So that basically means we're going to generate complete sequences of experience up to some terminal step or up to some horizon which we decide to start with as we've simulated far enough. We're going to draw those from our model using some policy. We're going to apply model-free reinforcement learning to these simulated episodes. So this could be Monte Carlo control. So that's one approach to model-free reinforcement learning that we've seen. If Monte Carlo control is applied to these simulations starting from now, we call it Monte Carlo search. That's the forward search algorithm based on simulation-based search that uses Monte Carlo control. If we apply something like the TD learning algorithm, such as SASA, the TD control method, then we call this TD search. Monte Carlo search, MC search, TD search. Okay. We're going to look at both of those now. Okay. So Monte Carlo simulation, first of all. So starting off with a model. This is our model that this might be given to us for the purposes of this discussion, or it might be something we learned. So it's going to be an approximate model. And we're going to have some simulation policy now. So this is a policy. For now, we're just going to assume that this is fixed, that someone gives us a way to behave. So imagine for now this is uniform random. We've got some random way to behave in our problem. And what we're going to do is we're going to use this simulation policy to simulate a bunch of episodes from the current state. So we'll start off in our current state. We're going to imagine a whole bunch of episodes starting from the current state, following this policy. And now we're going to apply Monte Carlo evaluation to evaluate this state. So what does that mean? Well, it just means take the mean return. So we ran a bunch of episodes and we want to know, well, how good is the current state? And the process is just to say, well, run 100 episodes using this simulation policy. We're going to estimate the value of this state by mean return. So we saw a return of 10 in one episode, a return of 20 in the other, so now we think it's got a value of 15 in this state. And we know that by the law of large numbers, this is Monte Carlo evaluation again, we know by the law of large numbers, this really will find the true value of, this should be SD. So this, we're just doing Monte Carlo evaluation but applied to the current state specifically, applied to this forward search idea of starting from now. Okay. So how do we turn that into a search algorithm? Well, the simplest idea, this is you might call this naive Monte Carlo search, that's actually been quite widely used, surprisingly successful. So the naive idea is you're given a simulation policy and your model. So now we're going to consider a bunch of different actions we might take. We're going to consider all the legal actions in our action set. And for each of those actions, we simulate a bunch of episodes. So we start in our start state, we consider one of those actions, and we run, say, k episodes, starting from this state and taking this action. And now we evaluate how good is it to be in this state and take this action by the mean of all of those episodes, the mean return. So this is just Monte Carlo evaluation on the action value function now. So we're estimating Q for the current state, and that particular action is just the mean of all returns that started from this state and that action. And again, by the law of large numbers, this really is going to give us the action value function for this particular simulation policy. Now once we have that, what can we do? Well, a very simple idea, which we've seen many times before, is just to pick the best action using our estimate of the action value function. So the idea would be that now the next real thing we do in the world is just the thing which actually worked best in all of our simulations. So one of these actions will have the highest mean, one of them will have got more returns in its set of simulations than the others, and that's the action that we pick. We do that action, and then we move on to the next state, and then for that next state we run another bunch of simulations again, we evaluate the mean return of each of those, or pick a new real action to do. So this is that process of thought. We're simulating again. We're estimating from our just computation what the value of those things is, and then after that process of thought we pick the next real thing to do in the world by just picking one of the highest value. Okay. So these ideas can be turned into state-of-the-art planning algorithm when we start to think about taking the next step beyond simple Monte Carlo search. So this idea is called Monte Carlo tree search. And the idea is to simulate episodes, again, starting from the current real state, which should be ST, and build a search tree now that contains the visited states and actions. So we can build a search tree where for each state that we visit is going to be a node in the search tree, and we're going to consider all the actions from each of those nodes in our search tree. And then every single simulation, what we're going to do is we're going to evaluate the states in this search tree by the mean return of all episodes that pass through that state and that action. So all of our episodes start at the root of this search tree, but the episodes that happen to pass through state S and we take action A will be used to evaluate that particular state and action. So each node has its separate evaluation, the mean return of all episodes that pass through that node. So this is Monte Carlo evaluation again. But the difference now is not only are we evaluating all states in the search tree, we're also improving the policy. We're doing control here. This is just like the generalized policy iteration methods you've seen time and again. So we evaluate the states by Monte Carlo, and all of the states and actions that we see we evaluate by the mean return from that states and action. But we also improve the simulation policy that we're using. So the simulations are going to get better and better and better over time now. We're not just, before, we just picked some arbitrary policy like random. Whereas now, we're going to make the simulation better and better and better. And the way we do that is by improving it, by using the tree to guide the simulations towards the most promising parts of the search space. So we've got these estimates of value in our tree, and those estimates can be used by just picking, for example, the action that maximizes this, which should be the action that maximizes this. And again, we might need to have some exploration. We'll talk about that next lecture. But you can imagine that there's some epsilon greedy exploration thrown in to make sure that we don't lock on to the wrong action. And finally, the tree doesn't contain everything. There will be states and actions that we visit which may not be in our tree yet. We might be in a large problem. This is typically used. Imagine I'll talk about the game of Go in a minute. There's 10 to the 170 states, and most of those states won't be in our search tree. So at some point we're going to come out of our search tree, and then at that point again we just need to have some random simulation policy that's used by default once we pop out of the search tree. So I'll give an illustration of this to make it a bit more concrete. But the property of this algorithm is rather nice. That this property will now converge on the optimal search tree. In other words, given our MDP model, this process will find the optimal look-ahead solution to that model. And it's easy to see that by realizing that we're just applying Monte Carlo control. We're just applying Monte Carlo control to a search tree that's growing until it contains the full table of all possible states and actions. Okay. So, Monte Carlo tree search. So, we can think of it as breaking down. This is not just a borrowed figure. So we're going to have this process where we go round and round this loop as many times as we can afford to do simulations. So this loop represents one sort of unit of thought again. We basically use our search tree to select the promising actions. So the values that are stored in these nodes, so maybe we think that this node has a higher value than this node based on the numbers that we stored in our memory so far. So we use those numbers to guide us towards the most promising parts of the search space. So we explore this part more deeply until eventually we're going to reach some leaf node. Then what we do is expand that leaf node. We add in a new node into the representation to represent this new part of the state space that we haven't seen before. We run some rollout or complete the simulation. We use our rollout policy to complete this by just behaving in some random way until we get to the end of our termination, or our horizon at which we stop. And then, based on the value that we see, the return for this whole episode, there's going to be some return for this whole episode, and that return is now going to be propagated back to all these nodes in the tree. This isn't like the error back propagation algorithm in neural networks, this is just a different word, right? So the total return has been propagated. Each of these nodes is now being updated to store the mean of all the values that we've seen from that node onwards. So some advantages of this approach, a bit more illustration in a minute, but what we get out of this is a highly selective algorithm, where because we're running in each simulation, we're coming back and we're committing again to a different side of the search tree, we're coming back, we end up spending many, many more simulations on the most promising parts of the search tree than we do on the less promising parts of the search tree. So it's a form of best first search where we commit more resources to the best parts of the search tree. But it evaluates states dynamically. In other words, we don't solve the entire MVP at once. We just start from our current state here, and we just dynamically start to figure out, well, how good is it to be in this state and take each of these actions. And then at the end of this whole process of thought, if we want to, we can essentially throw that away and start all over from fresh the next time, the next step. It uses sampling to break recursive dimensionality. So unlike traditional forward search methods, it can be very sample efficient, and it works for black box models. So in other words, because we're only sampling from our model, we don't need to know the explicit transition probabilities the way you do for something like dynamic programming. Okay. Enough advertising of the method. How does it actually do? Let me just see how much time we've got here. Okay, let me just say very briefly now. I think I'll come back to this. Okay. So I'll come back and do an illustration of this in just a minute. I think before I do that, I just wanted to add in one more idea, which is this idea of temporal difference search. So far we've seen Monte Carlo tree search. It's very effective, it works very well at Compute-Go, in a number of other domains, it's state of the art. But there's only one approach to simulation-based search, and there's reasons to think that we could use all the rest of the reinforcement learning technology that we've seen earlier on in the course to do better. And so in particular, we had this idea in earlier lectures that Monte Carlo was simple and effective, but it wasn't the most efficient of the policy evaluation algorithms that we looked at. So it's natural to wonder, well, what would happen if we used TD learning instead of Monte Carlo learning? We saw in pretty much all of the plots that we looked at before that TD tends to do a bit better than Monte Carlo due to bootstrapping, due to exploiting the Markov property of the domain. So can we do the same here? Well, the way to think of this is that we just looked at this idea of Monte Carlo tree search, which was applying Monte Carlo control to the sub-MDP starting from now. That's what Monte Carlo tree search is. You start from the current state, you simulate from your model. This gives you samples of the sub-MDP starting from now, just like our forward search approach. And then we apply Monte Carlo control, who we're alternating policy evaluation by Monte Carlo policy evaluation with something like epsilon greedy policy improvement. That's classic Monte Carlo control from on lecture 3. Okay, so Monte Carlo search, tree search applies Monte Carlo controls for sub-OMTP starting from now. And it's natural to ask, well, what happens if we use TD instead? So the idea of TD search is to apply SARSA control for sub-OMTP starting from now, instead of Monte Carlo control. So let's just think about, trading these two things off. Well, for model-free reinforcement learning, we know that bootstrapping tends to be very helpful in the sense of efficiency. We saw that TD learning reduces variance, it increases bias. In addition, it tends to be, as a result, it tends to be more efficient than Monte Carlo. It makes use of the Markov property, and it can do better from less data, which in this case means it can learn values more efficiently from fewer simulations. And we saw also that there was this lambda parameter that enabled us to trade off this spectrum between Monte Carlo and TD. The TD lambda could actually find something that was more efficient than either. So again, we can ask the same question now as a planning method. So as a planning method, if we want to do forward search using sample-based planning, then is the same true? And again, the answers are similar. TD search reduces variance, it increases bias. TD search is usually more efficient than Monte Carlo search when you can exploit this Markov property. And TD lambda search can be much more efficient than the equivalent Monte Carlo search. Okay. So what's the idea? Let's just spell it out. So the idea again is to simulate episodes from the current real state. So we start from now. And now we're going to estimate the action value function, Q. So you can think of this as a search tree, but more generally you just think that there's some representation of the state space. So we should say Q theta. So we're going to estimate some Q theta with some parameters theta. We're going to select our actions based on these action values. We're just doing SARSA, for example, using epsilon greedy. And then for each step of simulation, we're going to update the action values by SARSA. So every step, we're going to take our action values that we had before, move them a little bit in the direction of the TD error. This is SARSA. And we're just applying SARSA to that simulated experience. So you don't just have to be restricted to learning directly from the returns. You can apply SARSA, you can use the TD learning idea. And finally, I really just wanted to introduce this idea that we don't need to fixate on search trees as the only representation. Just because we're doing forward search doesn't mean that we need to have a search tree. So a search tree, well, what is a search tree? The search tree is kind of a table lookup approach, where for each state and action is represented separately in the search tree. So each state has its own node in the search tree. So if you have a very, very large state space or a very large branching factor, this can be somewhat slow and naive. So we can think of a search tree as kind of like a partial table lookup. It's like a table where we just haven't instantiated everything in the table. When that search tree gets to include everything, the search tree was infinitely deep. It would basically be table lookup again. Every state has its own value in the table. And what we saw in previous lectures is that we kind of thought of the table lookup approach as like that was the introductory lectures. In practice, what do people do? Well, in practice, people don't use table lookup. Why don't they use table lookup? Because A, you need a lot of memory to represent everything. B, it's very inefficient to learn about each state and action separately in a table. It's much more efficient to use function approximation so that you can generalize from one part of your state space to another. So that's a bit like saying you have some big search tree. And it turns out that this state over here is pretty much the same as this state over here. Well, if you use a search tree representation, you have to build up your whole subtree over here to figure out the value of this node in the search tree. And then you separately have to build up a whole big search tree over here to figure out the value of this guy. Whereas if you're using function approximation, you can do something like say, well, let me just have a feature that says I'm either in this guy or this node here, that these two nodes would share some feature. And then every time you have a simulation that passes through either of these, you would learn about the value of that feature. So you'd be learning about this one and this one. And so you'd only need to build up one search tree to learn about both of those things. That's the idea of using function approximation to help. Okay. So the problem with table lookup, what we saw in Model 3 reinforcement learning, is you can't store the value for all states. If your state space is big, if your branching factor is big, the search tree is quite limited in how much you can actually fit in there. And it doesn't generalize between similar states. Now in simulation-based search, table lookup isn't naive because we don't have to store everything. So it can store values for the easily reachable states. So that's good. We don't have to store everything in there because we're just doing this forward search. We only care about what happens from now onwards. But it still doesn't generalize between similar states. And so if you have a huge search space or a very large branching factor, then value function approximation can still be very helpful. So search trees are very effective. They do really well in practice. But for really large problems, you need some kind of generalization between similar states or similar actions. And this is certainly true in some of the bigger games that this approach has been applied to, such as Go. Okay, so the simplest approach to generalization is to have a linear function approximator. So we had a whole lecture on basically looking at linear function approximation as the main kind of case where, or the simplest case where you can generalize between the value function for one state and the value function for another state. And we had this idea that we represented the value function by a linear combination of features with some parameters. And then so now what we're going to do is use that same architecture in a forward search algorithm, a simulation-based search algorithm. We're going to simulate episodes from the current real state, SD. We're going to select actions based on the action values, Q theta. So that could just be epsilon greedy. So basically, we're back to the same ideas we've seen before. So we're applying SARSA here. We're applying linear SARSA. We're applying linear SARSA to simulations that start from the current state. And then for each simulated time step, we're going to apply a SARSA update to that simulated step. Okay. Now I think what I might do at this point, switch gear. I just try and, I'm seeing some faces that are telling me that these ideas aren't completely making sense yet, so I'm going to give just switch to a different presentation of some of these ideas in context. Okay, so the last lecture, by the way, is going to be all about applying the reinforcement learning methods that we've seen to board games. But I'm going to give like a 10-minute teaser, I think, rather than doing the Bayesian RL. A 10-minute teaser, which is about a particular game I've spent a lot of time working on. At least one other person in the audience has. And it's the game of Go. So it's the oldest game in the world, and by many people considered to be the hardest sort of classic board game. And it's since sort of chess, since Deep Blue came along and beat Gary Kasparov in chess, a lot of people have viewed Go as like the big challenge for AI to be able to beat humans at this task that was previously considered to require sort of human intuition to do very well in. And it turns out that the approaches that worked well in the game of chess, these brute force forward search algorithms, were very ineffective in the game of Go. And it actually requires simulation-based search to start to make progress in this game. Very briefly, it's a game where each player takes turns to place down stones. Black places down a stone here, white gets his turn, he places down a stone here. And pretty much the only rule you need to know about is that if stones are completely surrounded, like if this black stone is completely surrounded, or if these two black stones here were completely surrounded by white stones, then they get captured and removed from the board and they become prisoners at the other side. And then at the end of the game, the player with more territory, so white's got some territory here, this becomes all his points at the end of the game, black's got territory here, this becomes his points at the end of the game. So at the end of the game, the player with more points wins. Okay? So that's the setup. And so let's see how we might apply a simulation-based search to this to make it all a bit more concrete and understand how this might work. So we're going to say there's some game outcome. So the game outcome is, this is like the return. There's just a reward. There's no reward all the way through the game until the end of the game, but there's a reward of either 1 if black wins or 0 if white wins. So black is trying to get as much reward as possible by construct the symmetry. And so what we're going to do is try and evaluate a position. We're going to say the value of a particular policy. This could be like a simulation policy, like randomly we're going to evaluate a particular position S. So S is like a complete board position now. So this is a particular S, like some state is like the position of all the stones on the whole board. We want to know, well, how good is a particular state? How good is it to have 3 black stones over here and 2 white stones over there? And so one way to evaluate it is by saying, well, the definition of value is the expected reward that you're going to get from that position. Like, what's the expected outcome? Will I win or lose from this position? And we want to know, well, is it 80% or is it 60%? And then we want to pick the states. We want to prefer to move to the states where we have a higher value. Okay. And then what we're going to do is use this idea of minimap. So the only wrinkle on what we talked about is that changes it from the previous presentation. So we've got a 2-player game. So all that means is that black is trying to maximize the reward and white is trying to minimize the reward. That's the only thing which changes. Otherwise we can apply all the same machinery that we've seen so far. And what we're going to do is we're going to use Monte Carlo simulation to estimate this thing and tree search to estimate this thing. Put them together, you get Monte Carlo tree search. Okay. So we've already seen Monte Carlo simulation. In this context, it basically means you start in your position, you simulate n random games. So you can run some games using some random way to play for both players, and we're going to estimate the value of that position by the mean outcome of those simulations. So if we run 4 different games from this position here, and black wins 2 of them, and white wins 2 of them, then we would say, okay, well the value of this particular position is 0.5, 2 out of 4. Okay, so the simple Monte Carlo tree search, the simple Monte Carlo search with no tree we talked about was this idea that for each action we separately evaluate the position. So we're just going to run the same idea for each legal action that we can run from this position. We'll run a bunch of simulations and pick the action that does the best. Okay. So Monte Carlo tree search, we've talked about already, but the idea is we're now going to build a search tree containing values. And then when we're in the tree, we're going to behave somehow wiggly, and after that we're going to use our rollout policy. So just to run through, this is kind of the illustration I wanted to show you to make this concrete. So you start in some state. This star represents some node that you've never seen before. So we add this new node into your search tree, that's the star. These diamonds represent states that are visited during the simulation but not added into your search tree. And this square represents a terminal position where you end up, in this particular simulation, winning the game. So here, black won the game. We update the value of this state to say, okay, black won 1 game out of 1 simulation. So the value stored here is 1 out of 1. Now we try a new action, add a new state into the search tree, run a simulation from there. This ends up with a value of 0. So we ran this simulation using some random player from here, and it turns out that white won this game. So these are all from black's point of view, so now this is 0 out of 1. 0 wins for black out of 1 simulation from here. And now from this root state, we also update this to say now we've got 1 out of 2 from this root state. So now we think this is bad move to take, and we think our root state's about 50-50. So now we can start to use this information. So we've got some information in our search tree, so we want to avoid this and try something new. So we try a new action, we run a simulation, black ends up winning. We back that up, say, okay, now we've got 1 game out of 1 here, 2 out of 3 from the root. And now we can see this one's starting to look more promising than this one. So we go down this side again, pick another action from here, run a simulation from there, end up losing the game. So now black thinks 0 out of 1, 1 out of 2 from here, 2 out of 4. But again, this side's still looking more promising than this side. So again, we choose to go down this side again. This time black wins, result of 1. This gets backed up to 1 out of 1, 2 out of 3, 3 out of 5, and so forth. And as you can see, this generates a very unbalanced deep tree that can be very effective because we're investing a lot of resource on the more promising parts of the search space. Okay, I'm going to skip this, and what I wanted to show you so this is a plot showing how effective this method has been. So these asterisk programs, this is a history of computer Go since so computer Go, people have been trying to do computer Go since the 70s roughly, seriously, and this is a scale where Q grades are like amateur grades and Dan grades are like master grades roughly. So it's better to be higher. And these asterisk programs were like the best programs before the simulation-based search methods came along. And then when simulation-based search was invented, these programs, Crazy Stone and Logo, there was this big increase in performance. So this actually represents performance against human players on the biggest Go server. And now we can see that we've got programs. This has continued recently up to 5, possibly 6 Dan now. The strongest programs are playing at, which is roughly the level of the top human players in Europe. So we've gone from programs being very, very weak, using these new methods that scale up very effectively with more and more computation and clever ideas, to human master level. Okay. And now I just wanted to talk briefly about this idea of TD search. So what I wanted to show you was that we can use this idea of linear temporal difference learning, where we can basically represent our value function in terms of the linear combination of features. And we can do that just to do SARSA. So you could apply SARSA. Yeah. So let's say we took some features. Let's say our features were something like this. Like, do I have a white stone here? Do I have a black stone here? Do I have white stones in this shape here? That might be our set of features. We could have a very large number of features. You could combine those together using TD learning. So this would be linear SARSA that we saw in the previous lecture. If you just ran a whole bunch of games using this representation of value, using this representation of your features, you could build up a value function, you could train up your program to play, and you could learn a value function that's kind of telling you how to play the whole game of Go. Like all of these things, they start at the beginning of the game. They're learning weights for these features that tell you across the whole game how good is it to have this feature. That's what we're doing when we apply TD learning to the game of Go. Like these are actually, so this is real experience here. We're learning from real experience. We're running SARSA from real experience, playing out real games. From this, we're going to apply our SARSA updates to update the weights of these features and learn how good it is to have each of these shapes in that position. That's SARSA learning. The new idea is to do something with simulation-based search. So apply the same idea, but to samples that are simulated. You're going to run these simulations doing forward search starting from the current state. So if we start in this current state and just run simulations from here, we're sort of imagining how the game might play out from here. We're going to play out all these different games from this particular position. And for just this particular position then, we're going to learn basically weights that tell us how good is it to have these features in this particular position. So for all the things that might happen to me from here, is it good to have this shape or have a white stone here? So we're learning sort of some tailored feature weights that are tailored to the situation that the agent's facing now. It's learning how to climb the mountain rather than learning about the whole world. So basically we're applying reinforcement learning and specializing all that knowledge that it's learning to the situation that it's about to face. We're sampling the future, we're learning about what to do in those samples from the future. It's like you're imagining things, you're dreaming what might happen next, and then you learn from your imagination how to behave. Okay. So that's kind of what I wanted to say. So just for fun, this is the first thing you learn as a Go player. Don't make this shape, it's a bad shape. It's called the empty triangle. Okay? But the next thing you learn, if you're a bit stronger, is that occasionally there are these shapes called gazumi, which basically means something like a shape that's normally bad but happens to be good in this situation. And you kind of learn that there are special cases. So in certain situations you should do this. And what's nice is that when you do this temporal difference search, so when you do TD learning, if you do something like TD learning, you're able to learn something like this shape is bad in general. When you do TD search, you're able to learn something like this shape is good right here. Yeah. Okay. And this turns out to be more effective than multicolor search but less effective than the most sophisticated ways to use Monte Carlo tree search, particularly for optimization. Anyway, thank you. It's all right to get rough.
Thank you.